Hello again, everyone. I'm Dr. George Simon, and welcome to another edition of the new Character Matters program. This is the program where we talk about what I consider to be the defining issue of our time, the character crisis that we face, and that affects so many aspects of our lives. And we have been talking about some of the 10 commandments of character that I introduced first in my book, Character Disturbance, The Phenomenon of Our Age. This is the book that talks about all the wide range of character disturbances and how to tell them, how to distinguish them, how to tell them apart, how to know whether somebody you are thinking about becoming involved with in a relationship or have been involved with or are in a relationship with has a disturbance of character. It's the first book that explained the vast spectrum of character disturbances, spectra actually of both type and degree. We live in an age where many more problems arise, not so much out of a person's insecurities, emotional hangups, low self-esteem, et cetera, et cetera. These are the traditional things that brought folks into traditional therapy. But these days, more and more, over the past several decades, the problems people have had in their lives and bring into the lives of others stem not so much from those traditional complaints, but rather from disturbances in people's character, inadequately formed character, inadequately developed character, lacking the internal resources to manage themselves in a healthy way and to conduct their relationships in a healthy way. Too much narcissism, too much of a sense of entitlement, all kinds of other aspects of poorly formed character. And as I've mentioned in the programs past, character is itself like our psychological immune system. When we have a very well-formed and solid, strong character, we can navigate this crazy mixed up world a little bit better and not succumb to some of the temptations that cause us to become addicted, that cause us all kinds of other problems in our lives. So the importance of character can't be overstated. And that's why I first introduced these 10 commandments, as I call them, or important life lessons or axioms in my book, Character Disturbance, so many years ago, and have been working on a new book, an expanded version of these, probably my last book, but a thorough investigation of what it takes to build a life of integrity and what we have to do to stem the tide of character disturbance that affects so many aspects of our lives. To make character matter once again. So my new book, I hope to have to the publisher for final edits and preparation for release, hopefully around Christmas time. I hope to have that to the publisher by Thanksgiving, really working on it very hard. Spent more time on this book than anything else because I wanted to get it right and because I consider it so important. And in today's program, we're going to begin a discussion about the next commandment that I want to be talking about, which has to do with thinking before acting and gaining the kind of self-control that we need to have to lead a well-tempered, well-moderated life. instead of a life lived on impulse. So, simply stated, the commandment is this: think before you act, and mindfully so. Be master over your impulses. Be prudent. Now, this seems like a very trite little commandment, but I have to tell you, I've had years and years and years of counseling experience. And I can tell you that I've met all too many folks whose lives were driven by their impulses, as opposed to being moderated by reason and prudence. And unfortunately, we live in times where almost 1 in 4 children is medicated just so that they can pay attention well enough and behave themselves in school. This would have been unheard of in times past. And I'm not saying that there aren't those cases where the biology is such, or the neurology is such, that some children simply can't focus and can't sit still. There are those cases. But in all too many cases today, unfortunately, we're too quick to sedate or to use stimulant drugs or to use other means to help do for young people and older folks what used to be the purview of character, of self-management, the skills to delay gratification, and a few other things. So we're going to begin the discussion about that today. And I feel compelled right at the outset to mention something that's not very well talked about, especially as it affects our young people. And once again, I am not talking about those cases that are legitimate, and there are such cases. I actually had some training at one of the centers that was at the forefront of the discovery of this. There are such cases where children simply cannot, because of how their systems work neurologically, cannot focus very well. Frankly, I was one of those children when I was younger. We didn't even have a name for it at that time. Unfortunately, we miscategorized kids. We branded them as either lazy or something else. So I'm not talking about that, but I'm talking about what's become an epidemic. And I want to begin the discussion about it, about talking about a phenomenon that's been going on for several years now. We have these devices and games and sources of stimulation that have certain characteristics to them, and that a lot of our children are addicted to. These games and devices provide, number one, high rate, number two, high intensity stimulation with almost immediate rewards of some nature. Something happens in the game, whether it's a video game or whatever, or whether they're on social media. There's a lot of titillation, a lot of stimulation. It comes at a very fast rate. And the payoffs from a psychological perspective, the things that make us feel good, make us laugh, or get our energy up, or satisfy us in some way, they come pretty quickly. And human beings, the way we're wired, all of us, we habituate to our environments. We build tolerance to things. So when we overexpose young people to these high intensity, high rate, instant payoff kinds of sources of stimulation. And then we put them in an environment like a classroom where the stimulation level is lower, where the rate of stimulation is lower, and where the satisfaction or payoffs is more longer term. Is it any wonder? Is it any wonder at all that some folks feel bored out of their skull and can't do it? And maybe sit in the back of the room and watch TikTok on the phone or anything to get that stimulation fix back. There are so many things that we are doing that inadvertently impair our ability to learn what we need to learn, to build the internal resources that we need to build so that we can function in a more adaptive way. This is all part of character, building in the skills and resources. This is all part of character. And it's a big challenge today. I mentioned what I did there for two reasons. One is because I think it's one of the reasons why there's this explosion of young folks that have trouble finding sufficient stimulation in inherently low stimulation environments. And number two, I think is also part of the reason why folks aren't developing the internal resources they need to be more mindful and not just act on impulse. We have so much available. Folks don't have to wait. They can find stimulation right around the corner at an instant. Just pull out the phone. We have so many things that inadvertently make it harder than ever to develop a mindful character. And then on top of that, all of the mentors that young folks need to help them develop those resources are very, very busy and not available. I've said this many times. I've said it in my book, Character Disturbance. I'll say it again. And I'm making the point very strongly in my current book. Socialization is a process, and for human beings, it's a very, very lengthy process. For us to function well, it takes more time, more energy, more careful teaching than for any other creature on the planet. We are the only species that can't take care of itself relatively soon after being born. It takes days, months, years, year after year after year. Folks are maturing these days because of all these other things I mentioned and because of all the obstacles to developing good character. Folks are maturing in their late 30s, 40s, 50s, sometimes 60s, sometimes 70s. Life takes on an entirely different color. Possibilities abound. When folks can enter young adulthood already equipped with all the character resources to lead not only a responsible, but an enthusiastic and spirit-filled life. Folks figure it out these days, long about the third or fourth marriage. They figure out what an intimate relationship needs to be. We're maturing late. And one of the reasons is because we have a hard time learning to manage our impulses and to think before we act. We tend to act on impulse. It's normal for children to do that. But we expect as we grow up that we have a greater ability. So it's perfectly normal when we're children to simply act on impulse, to want what we want and to want it now, to have an urge or have a feeling and simply act on it. That's normal. The enterprise that we call character formation is all about instilling and internalizing the controls that we need to curtail our primal instincts and to manage them better so that we can get along in a civilized world. But developing these internal controls, internalizing the lessons and internalizing the mechanisms and the skills necessary to control ourselves seems to be harder than ever. And there are a lot of sociocultural factors responsible for that, not the least of which is a culture of incredible entitlement, instant gratification, ease of access to every kind of stimulation you can imagine. We have a harder time learning proper impulse control. So now, when somebody is injured or upset and is mad at the world and feels like killing somebody, there's nothing to stop them. Somebody has to pay, they feel. And they feel perfectly entitled to take their wrath out. So the task of character development is primarily to learn how to stop and contemplate what you're about to do before you do it, so that you don't just act on impulse, but it's more than thinking before acting. Again, it's much more than just thinking before acting. What and how you think matters. This is the point that I raised in all of my books, most especially in Sheep's Clothing, where I outlined some of the tactics that manipulative people do, and in my book, Character Disturbance, where I outline the many distorted ways of thinking that people who haven't grown up in character sufficiently engage in. They engage in several distorted ways of thinking. And you see this almost infantile way of thinking almost all the time in our discourse on social media, especially. Someone will point out, for example, someone's egregious display of bad character, and almost immediately someone will say, well, so-and-so does that too. I'm thinking primarily in the political arena, where we have great debates and great divides, and we can't seem to come together. And everybody points the finger and says, well, so-and-so does this too, or did that too. Like any of that matters. Like your mother never said, well, if Johnny's going to jump in the lake, are you going to jump in the lake too? I remember hearing that when I was very young. We have so many things in our culture that interfere now with the installation of reasonable controls over our impulses. We are not trained to simply not take and to simply not do whenever we feel like doing, to not hesitate, We are not trained to think first and do later. So instead, we do first and maybe think later. And then, God help us, maybe we will think in correct terms about what we did. It's not enough just to learn to be mindful. What we think matters too. And to instill the proper mindset in folks and to reinforce folks for being more contemplative about life in general and caring about the impact of their behavior and learning how to control themselves, learning how to delay gratification, learning how to bear with the discomfort of situations that aren't immediately stimulating and rewarding or satisfying or gratifying. Instilling in folks that capacity is a harder task than ever. And we have too many things working against it. One, the culture, and secondly, the lack of availability of the teachers. I'm not talking about academic teachers who have their hands full. I'm talking about all of the adult mentors that it has always taken to help form the character of individuals and help them develop the resources and the skills to manage themselves so that they aren't so dependent on structures and medicines and helping professionals and everybody else in the known world to manage for them what they should rightfully have learned to manage for themselves. This trend cannot continue. And as I mentioned before at the outset of the program, this is just the beginning of a discussion on what we need to do to turn things around, especially when it comes to learning how to control ourselves. All too many folks these days succumb to various addictions of one type or another. And they tell helping professionals all the time, I don't think I can break this or that bad habit because they haven't developed the skills and the resources to do so. And too many times professionals are too willing to lend too much of a hand and deprive folks of the motivation necessary to build controls within themselves. So as I mentioned, this is going to be a fairly substantial discussion over the next few episodes. So I hope you'll tune in, and I hope you'll avail yourself of my other work, my 3 books, In Sheep's Clothing, Understanding and Dealing with Manipulative People, Character Disturbance, the Phenomenon of Our Age, the Judas Syndrome, and How Did We End Up Here, with my co-author, Dr. Kathy Armistead. And also avail yourself of the many timely articles on my blog at drgeorgesimon.com. That's drgeorgesimon.com. And then I hope you all tune in again for another edition of the New Character Matters, where we'll be continuing this discussion on what we need to do to develop a better ability to control ourselves and to be less dependent upon external sources of control, including the medications that sometimes are necessary, but that we become far more reliant on than is healthy for us. So once again, thanks for tuning in. I'll see you again next time on the next edition of the New Character Matters. I'm Dr. George Simon. Take care.